Right now, you might be sitting in a drive-thru lane, waiting to be handed a paper bag that smells like salt, grease, and pure joy. You're about to eat a hamburger. It feels like the ultimate modern convenience, the absolute peak of industrial fast food. But taking a hunk of meat, crushing it up, shaping it, and throwing it on a fire is actually one of the oldest and most fundamental things our species has ever done. It's an act older than writing, older than the wheel, older than agriculture. The question is, who was the first person to look at a tough piece of animal protein and say, I should smash this into a circle and cook it, and how did that weird idea conquer the globe? To find the absolute earliest origins of the burger, we have to rewind the clock way back. I'm not talking about a century ago. I'm talking roughly 2.6 million years ago, on the sweltering savannas of East Africa. Meet our distant ancestors, early hominins like Homo habilis. These guys were not exactly apex predators. They were small, slow, and mostly scavengers. When they managed to get their hands on some meat, it was usually the tough, gristly leftover scraps that a lion or a saber-toothed cat had left behind. But here's the problem. Raw, wild animal meat is incredibly tough. If you've ever tried to chew through a cheap, overcooked steak, you know it takes some serious jaw strength. Now imagine that steak is raw, fresh off a wild antelope, and you don't have a knife or a fork. Our ancient ancestors were spending millions of chewing cycles, hours and hours every single day, just trying to extract basic calories from raw muscle. Until somebody had a brilliant idea. Archaeologists digging at sites in Kenya and Tanzania have found ancient animal bones covered in very specific, deliberate smash marks, right alongside smooth, heavy cobblestones. Our ancestors realized that if they took a rock and repeatedly bashed the raw meat against another rock, they could break down the tough muscle fibers before they even put it in their mouths. They pre-chewed with rocks. This was the birth of ground meat, the great-great-grandfather of the hamburger patty. And it changed everything, because less energy spent chewing meant more energy available for other things, like surviving. But a smashed pile of raw scavenger meat isn't exactly a happy meal. It was just desperate survival. The next massive upgrade in the burger timeline happened around 1 million years ago, in places like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa. That's where we find some of the earliest solid evidence of controlled fire. When you take that smashed, tenderized meat and throw it onto hot coals, something magical happens. The heat denatures the proteins. It melts the fat. It kills the microscopic bacteria that would otherwise kill you. But most importantly, cooking unlocks a massive amount of bioavailable calories. And this is the pivot. Here is what makes this so incredibly important. The combination of smashing meat and cooking it isn't just a fun piece of culinary trivia. It is the biological catalyst that made you human. Because we outsourced our digestion to stone tools and fire, our bodies didn't need massive, heavy primate jaws and huge digestive tracts anymore. Over hundreds of thousands of years, our jaws shrank, our intestines shortened, and all that surplus biological energy, it went straight to the brain. Without ground, cooked meat, we literally do not evolve the brain power to invent things like language, art, or, ironically, the drive-thru window. Think about that. So, we have cooked, pounded meat. But for a very long time, this was just dinner. It wasn't a distinct cultural dish. To get closer to the modern burger, we have to fast forward to the 13th century. On the sprawling, freezing steppes of Asia, enter Genghis Khan and the Golden Horde. The Mongol army was a terrifyingly fast cavalry force. They moved across continents at speeds that baffled their enemies, sometimes riding for days with barely any stops. But a moving army needs to eat, and stopping to set up a nice campfire and roast a whole sheep just wasn't an option. They needed protein on the go. According to historical lore, Mongol horsemen would take scraps of raw horse or camel meat and place them right under their leather saddles. As they rode, the constant friction, the heat of the animal, and the weight of the rider would relentlessly pound the meat against the horse's back. By the end of a long day of conquering, the meat was pulverized into a tender, flat paste that could be eaten raw right on the battlefield. Gross? Maybe a little. Efficient? Absolutely. When Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, invaded Russia, the Mongol cavalry brought this pounded meat tradition with them. The Russians tasted it, adopted it, threw in some chopped onions and raw eggs for flavor, and called it steak tartare, named after the Tartar people of the Mongol Empire. It was a massive hit. But we are still missing a crucial element. We have a raw meat paste. We need a hot, cooked patty. As global trade exploded in the 17th and 18th centuries, Russian ships frequently docked at the largest, busiest port in Germany, Hamburg. The German sailors and butchers tried the Russian steak tartare, but they decided to put their own spin on it. They started taking cheap cuts of regional beef, mincing it up with a grinder, and heavily seasoning it with salt, pepper, and garlic to hide any questionable smells. They formed it into a thick, round patty and then did what our cavemen ancestors did. They threw it on the fire. They called it the Hamburg steak. It was cheap, it was heavy, and it tasted surprisingly good. In the 19th century, as millions of German immigrants packed into overcrowded ships and crossed the Atlantic to seek a new life in America, they brought the recipe for Hamburg steak with them. By the late 1800s, you could find Hamburg steak on menus in New York and Chicago. But there was still one glaring problem. If you ordered a Hamburg steak in a restaurant in 1890, it came on a plate. You had to sit down, you had to use a knife and a fork. But America at the turn of the 20th century was not a sit-down kind of place. The Industrial Revolution was roaring. Cities were exploding with skyscrapers and factories. Working-class people had short lunch breaks and needed cheap, hot calories that they could eat with one hand while rushing back to the assembly line. You couldn't eat a hot, greasy Hamburg steak with your bare hands. It burned your fingers, it ruined your clothes, and it fell apart. Someone, somewhere, had to solve the grease problem. The exact inventor of the modern hamburger bun is hotly debated. Some say it was a guy named Charlie Negreen, who supposedly flattened a meatball and put it between two slices of bread at a Wisconsin county fair in 1885 so his customers could walk around while eating. Others claim it was Louis Lassen of New Haven, Connecticut in 1900. But the true democratization of the burger, the moment it became a unified, culturally dominant object, happened in 1921 in Wichita, Kansas. At the time, ground beef had a terrible reputation. Author Upton Sinclair had just published The Jungle, a book exposing the horrifyingly unsanitary conditions of American meatpacking plants. The public was terrified of ground meat. They thought it was full of scraps, chemicals, and floor sweepings. A man named Edgar Waldo Billy Ingram partnered with a fry cook named Walt Anderson to fix this. They opened a little restaurant and called it White Castle. To prove their meat was clean, they painted the building gleaming white and made the kitchens out of spotless stainless steel so customers could watch the food being cooked. But Walt Anderson's real stroke of genius was the engineering of the food itself. Instead of serving a giant, messy Hamburg steak, he smashed the beef into a small, thin, square patty. He cooked it screaming hot and fast over a bed of onions. And crucially, he placed it inside a specially designed, soft, squishy yeast bun that absorbed the meat juices without falling apart. The bun wasn't just bread. It was an edible napkin. It was a carrying case. White Castle sold them for 5 cents a piece by the sackful. They were clean, uniform, and perfectly engineered for the speed of modern life. The hamburger was officially born. From there, the explosion was inevitable. The brothers Richard and Maurice McDonald saw this fast-paced model and applied Henry Ford's assembly line logic to it in the 1940s. They stripped the menu down, sped up the griddle, and built an empire of golden arches. Suddenly, a survival technique invented by desperate primates to save their teeth had become a multi-billion-dollar global industry. So, here's the full picture. We start 2 in a million years ago with a desperate hominin bashing a tough scrap of scavenged meat with a river stone. Then we add the magic of fire to shrink our guts and grow our brains. Then, the Mongol army tenderizes it under a saddle to fuel an empire. Then, German sailors fry it up in the bustling ports of Europe. And, finally, American fry cooks wrap it in a custom-built bread sponge to feed the Industrial Revolution. Next time you pull up to that drive-thru window and unwrap a warm, greasy, perfectly circular burger, take a second to respect the history you are holding. You aren't just eating fast food. You are taking part in a 2.6-million-year-old culinary tradition that literally shaped the human face, fueled the expansion of empires, and perfectly adapted to every era of human history. We didn't just invent the burger invented us. If you liked tracking down the bizarre origins of everyday things, stick around. There are plenty more human mysteries to uncover. I'll see you in the next one.